The Bible tells us to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And if you have children, you wake up and there are hungry, naked people right there in your house. They're right there for you. That the idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of actually desiring the good of another person more than your own comfort or immediate happiness, I think marriage and parenthood both make these things not easy, but easier and simpler and more straightforward.
Would you guess that compared to the 20th century, dads in the 21st century spend more time with their kids? Okay, how about this? That moms work more hours outside the home? That's probably, that's the case. But let's try this. Do you know that moms are still spending more time with their kids, even though they're working more in the 21st century compared to the 20th? And that at the same time, family size has shrunk. Well, you put that all together, and Timothy Carney is right. There is something wrong here. And in his new book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be, published by Harper, he writes this: somehow, mom and dad have become full-time chauffeurs, Secret Service agents, and playmates, while both parents work full-time jobs. Carney wants us to know that today's maximum effort, high anxiety, low trust parenting hasn't produced high quality parenting. He writes this: our culture expects a person more and more to handle his life on his own, stripped of the support, guidance, expectations, and meaning traditionally provided by religion, community, and extended family. This supposedly liberating modernity makes life a lot harder. Absolutely. Well, Carney is a father of 6 children, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and columnist at the Washington Examiner. He wants to show us a way of life that makes family easier, makes parents less anxious, and makes kids happier. Well, Tim, who doesn't want that? Thanks for joining me on Gospelbound, Tim.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to explore a lot of things in this conversation, including why American civil society has collapsed in just the past 2 generations, kind of the broader backdrop of the story that you tell in this book. But can you identify a moment or a date, Tim, when you believe that our culture became family unfriendly?
I mean, I think it's been a process, and you point to one of the causes there, which is the collapse in civil society, something Robert Putnam famously charted in Bowling Alone. I wrote about it in a previous book. But I would say that what you have from the 1960s to the 2000s was one big shift where we became more individualist, went too far in that direction, where, the whole sexual revolution, including the birth control pill, introduced the idea that every child is a choice that you ought to agonize over, delay, postpone, plan. And so if you made that choice, you're stuck with it. It's your kid. It's not our problem to help you with it. And at the same time, I remember I'm going to throw you a handful of moments here. I remember the 1980s in New York City when crime was really high, and there were a handful of real high profile child abductions or disappearances. Right. And that just struck this fear that this could happen to you and will happen to you if you don't hover over your child at every moment. Yeah. And then in the last 20 years, one of the things that's happened in sort of what's trickled down from the upper middle class to the middle class is a high intensity parenting, the teaching that, well, if you have fewer kids and you give them absolutely everything, then you're doing your duty to the kids. So you replace the local little league with the travel sports team, et cetera. Keep them busy. Don't waste their time by letting them idly run around the neighborhood. That's something that I think really has ramped up in the last 25 years or so.
Tim, am I wrong in saying, in response to that series of issues and events, that all of these are unintended consequences? They were not intended consequences. I mean, the birth control pill, obviously it's intended to give more control over reproduction, but I don't necessarily think that we would have seen the widespread adaptation toward an entirely different approach to parenting where, as you pointed out there, the entire conception is, well, we don't have to help you because you know what caused that, and you
Yes.
could have stopped that from happening.
No, and certainly that. I mean, the birth control pill did not drive down out of wedlock births. There's a lot more of them, and it did drive down marriage rates and the number of babies born to married couples. And I argue in Family and Friendly that part of this is about that idea that you just articulated there. Well, it's your choice. I remember once there was a debate over universal basic income. This is an idea that we kind of just cut everybody a check. Sometimes people say, replace welfare programs with everybody gets a check for $12,000 a year. And I said, would my family get 8 of these checks? This is me, my wife, and 6 kids. And somebody said, no, you and your wife would each get a check. If you chose to spend that money on children, I'm choosing to spend that money on gaming and riding my motorcycle. The government shouldn't be picking winners or losers. And it's an argument I understand. We shouldn't subsidize motorcycles or boats, but I don't think that having a kid is like deciding to get a motorcycle or deciding to get a boat. But that notion really has trickled throughout society where we say, well, it's not our job to help other people raise their kids. And I have a direct quote from a U.S. senator saying that. And that idea is just foreign to all of human history. It has always been seen that bringing in a new generation is the responsibility of society. The parents, the nuclear family, are absolutely 100% the heart and soul of that. The parents have the decisions, but they need and deserve support from the community. And I do think the abandonment of that idea is downstream from a lot of the cultural changes of the 1960s.
Sometimes, Tim, when I'm talking about biblical interpretation, I'll say things like, sometimes things were so obvious or taken for granted that they aren't explicitly mentioned in Scripture, and that their absence doesn't mean that Scripture has, a modern view on that topic. I wonder if what you're saying is somewhat analogous there, that the fact that society would expect children and would support children was in some ways so obvious as to not even need to be explicit. But then with these changes you're identifying since the 1960s, it's like taken for granted that that's not the case because it wasn't explicit. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
I think so. And I think that part of what I argue, and I look at subcultures in the U.S., in places like Israel, and they're almost all religious subcultures, my own Catholic circles in the Washington, D.C. area, where it's just kind of normal to get married shortly after college in your early 20s. And it's just kind of normal to keep going and have 4, 5, 6, 10 kids. And I say pregnancy is contagious, but what I really mean is that you don't have to you're not making some bizarre, extraordinary decision if you get married at age 24 and if you have the 4th kid, or if you have the kid that causes you to upgrade to the 12-seater van, what we call the Catholic assault vehicle. And we see other people doing it. We see that it's possible. And that what is normal really is a powerful force. But I want to be careful here because also, as a Catholic, I believe not everybody is called to marriage and parenthood. We have priests, we have nuns, we have all sorts of other calls to sort of lifelong celibacy and singlehood, etc. But so that means that there's kind of a normal path that you're expected to take, but you can personally, individually make a decision to go off on another road. Now I think we're the opposite. The expected normal path is this sort of, you spend your 20s and 30s as a dude in an extended adolescence. And maybe when you're pushing 40, you think, okay, I'm done with the happy hours and the video games. Maybe now I'll make the decision to settle down. Once that burden of decisions shifted to, will I get married and will I have kids? I think not only did it reduce the number of marriages and kids, but it increased the sort of psychological burden of having children.
By the way, as Protestants, we just call those homeschool vans.
I like it.
Same idea. It's interesting that you singled out men with extended adolescence, because I don't think we'd say, certainly not in D.C., that women, that would be an extended adolescence. Instead, that's for grad school, making a lot of money, rising the professional ladder, developing economic independence, and then considering marriage. Why would those two scripts be so different?
I mean, it really is a story. I mean, I think just that would be a great basis for an article. You should write it, or I will. But so that career comes first, I think, gets pounded into the head of both men and women in upper middle class and middle class America.
Yeah, people go to DC. That's pretty common in general.
But also here in DC, to sort of give you an insight, what being a congressional staffer, for instance, you work on Capitol Hill, and there are happy hours 5-6 nights a week.
Right.
That you can go to. And my wife actually worked on Capitol Hill when she was about 22, and she was having fun at something, and she was talking to one of her colleagues who maybe was the legislative director, and she realized he was like 38. And she thought, wait a second. I've had fun doing this for the last year. I do not want to be doing this for the next 16 years.
Right.
And she had to like put the car in brake and stop, take a hard right turn, and go back and live with her parents to avoid that track. But yeah, the careerism and the workism I talk about, and I think that there is an idea that really is pounded into the heads of a lot of women that you do need to have that financial independence before you can get started. And I quote one woman I interviewed in my book who said, I would like to get married and have kids. The obstacle is that if I did that, that would require dialing back from some of my work, which would leave me with some erosion of my skills and connections. And then if my husband left me, I would really be in bad shape, which is not a false story. It's not a 0% probability, but that so many people are building their lives around worrying about that. What does that mean? It means that independence is the goal. And maybe the reason the stories are different is partly that, men are more likely to use their independence for just sort of frivolous pursuits, and women are more likely to use them for advancing something worthwhile, which is a reason for men and women to get married and to join.
Quite true.
Yes.
Quite true. I can't remember, Tim, if you put this in your book, but it's one of the most shocking things I've seen probably in my career. And we wrote about it at the Gospel Coalition. A survey had gone out about parents' expectation for their kids. And this would primarily be Gen X parents, millennial parents. Maybe there were some boomer parents in there. I can't remember the survey dates. But when it came to priority for their kids, almost 100% of the focus was, I want them to be financially independent.
Yep.
I want them to have good jobs. And then when it came to marriage and having kids, these young people's grandkids, there was almost no priority at all. So it's easy to focus on the kids in these situations, but it's plainly evident that the kids are basically doing what their parents told them to do, which is focus on money, focus on career. That will bring happiness. And if you feel like it, at some point, maybe you get married, maybe you have kids, but it's really not a priority. Did you talk about it in the book? I can't remember.
I do. And one of you always wonder what's going on. Like, I would love to sit down and have follow-up interviews with a lot of these parents on it, because I have trouble thinking that it's just materialism, that it's just, I hope my son is as rich as possible. I hope my daughter, I don't think it is that. I think some of it is a perception of precarity, that like, if you try to go the middle of the road, you might fall off into poverty. That perception's really increased, especially among middle class and upper middle class parents who sort of feel like, wow, I got kind of lucky. I don't want my kid to fall off the other side.
And
of the
since
cliff.
2009 in particular.
Yeah, since the financial crisis has created this this perception of that we're constantly precarious. I think another part of it is not wanting to seem preachy. Now, if you're a parent, you are supposed to be preachy, and all parents basically accept that you are supposed to dictate certain things. But dictating, do your homework, get into as good a college as possible, get a job, that seems to be less judgy, less value driven than saying, you know what we did, what our friends did, getting married, raising kids, raising them in the church, that's good. Well, for a religious parents who have that at the central of their life, that seems very natural. But if you're less religious, you think, okay, I don't want to be too preachy in how to live your life, especially if there's multiple good options out there.
I think that's a boomer shift. I think that was the boomer parents that shifted in that regard. certainly I've seen that in my own experience, but that seems to be where that changed. There's another thing you write in Family Unfriendly, quote, "Someone has convinced us that parenting should involve much more effort than any generation before us put in." My question is, Tim, who's the someone?
I don't know. The devil?
It's got to be. That's perfectly, Paul. That's an acceptable answer on Gospelbound.
Yes. So you may have had the same experience in childhood I did, which was you get on your bike, you're pulling out of the driveway, and mom says, dinner is at 6:30, be home by then. And this is at 8:30 in the morning on a summer day. And, the constant line, the cliche for Gen Xers and older millennials, I think, was when the streetlights turn on, that's when you come home. And the level of freedom implied in that is out the window for most parents, most kids. You have to almost actively choose that or be lucky enough to end up in a neighborhood or a social circle where that's the norm, because that is not the norm for two reasons. One, fear of safety, most of which I argue in the book is overblown. Your child is not likely to get abducted.
The milk carton phenomenon. Just so people know where that comes from. It's the milk cartons in the 80s. Go ahead.
Yes. And so that 1 in a million risk of a child abduction gets made to think, well, this is constantly happening and this will happen to your kid unless you're constantly vigilant. Yeah. But also it happens because we want to overprogram our kids to make sure they have every advantage. Right. We had friends when we lived next to a playground, basically friends who lived on the other side who we never saw because there was school to ballet to violin to dinner to homework to bed. Except, after dinner on Sundays, maybe they can get together. And so there's that. But then there's also, in addition to the fear, the over programming, there's also stuff like the built environment. I talk about walkability, bikeability. Right. I mean, even where we live, we let our kids ride and walk around the neighborhood, but there aren't sidewalks in part of it. Like, come on, how are you building a place that's totally car dependent? Because what does car dependent means? It means that the kids are largely parent dependent. And that's a drag for parents and it's a big drag for kids. And that lack of independent play really is harmful. I cite op-eds by pediatricians saying, I think there's a childhood anxiety epidemic. And the root cause is the lack of kids just running around the neighborhood.
And ironically, Tim, those kids then grow up and don't want to drive. Because they haven't had independence, so that car-built environment ends up collapsing on itself. Tim, are these trends on parenting particular to the United States or the West?
Well, some of them are and some of them aren't. So I talk about the birth rate. I mean, that's a great place where, we should probably mention it by now at least, that we've gone from 2.1 babies per woman in 2006 when my wife and I started a family down to 1.62. That is from the replacement level down to well below it. Other countries, wealthy countries in Europe, Northern Europe and Southern Europe, in East Asia, they have all had the same sort of collapse down to well below the replacement level. And I think that economics has something to do with it. I think culture is the main explanation. And in some of these cultures, it is workism, certainly in Asia, certainly in Northern Europe, where you see the government try to help families by saying, okay, here's universal daycare. And what does that do? That just makes everybody more work-centric and less family-centric. Yeah. And then, so that workism where work replaces God and family, that's a huge cause. That's not present in all the cultures, though. In some places, it's a lack of men having ambition. I think that's Southern Europe. I think that's true in part in some subcultures in the U.S. where men are, as I'm saying, are in this perpetual adolescence. So there are cultural differences across all of these. The walkability is true in some places. I think that's mostly a problem in the U.S. The common thread culturally, I would argue, is what I call civilizational sadness. That is a belief that we're not good. You ask yourself, are we generally good? Well, I think the Christian answer is we are good but fallen. I think that, we ultimately made in the image of God and that humans are something to celebrate. And I don't think that is the modern secular answer. I think the modern secular answer went from being, well, you are whatever you want, just be yourself, let your freak flag fly, to now being, you are 52 tons of carbon dioxide. Yeah. You are fundamentally racist. And that argument, and then frankly, if you spend any significant time on social media, and sometimes I spend too much time on Twitter, you have trouble believing that the human race is good, and you start to feel really bad about yourself. And true. So, I mean, I think all of those things have convinced, and so that's the thread from the U.S. to Germany to Italy to Japan is, well, are we good? And for a lot of people, the answer is no, I don't think we're good.
So is abortion a cause or a result of this infertility decline?
So almost all of these things, I always say the causality goes both ways. But an abortion rebound started before COVID. It was falling for decades.
Right.
And it started, and the rebound was mostly concentrated among married women already in their 30s. So that's still a minority of abortions, but it started there. And so to me, that was saying abortion was shifting from desperate women facing a pregnancy with nobody to support them, making the wrong decision in a horrible situation, to a sadder almost story of people who could theoretically raise a kid and just decide, well, no, it's not a good thing to let this child come to this world.
Mm. Well, what do you, we've been talking about this already. My guest, Timothy Carney, talking about family unfriendly, how our culture made raising kids much harder. We've been talking about this family breakdown we see in the West, especially in the United States, since the 1960s. But what do you see as the biggest reason behind that? Because answering that question, I think, helps us know what to do today or what to focus on. I'm wondering, is it primarily a matter of secularism, or a secularism kind of downstream from some other change? Because one of the themes of your book is that the more religious, the highly observant, and it's not unique to a particular religious tradition. Mm-hmm. That tends to be the case within Christianity, whether it's Catholic or Protestant. Also happens to be the case with Mormons. I believe it's also the case with Muslims. That's certainly the case around the world, no doubt. And so there clearly is, it's kind of it's not that the entire, yes, the aggregate is going down when it comes to family breakdown and fertility rates and all that sort of stuff. But as you point out, there's all these different subcultural differentiation, and it's almost always religious.
Yep.
I'm actually not sure. Are there any examples that aren't religious?
There's nowhere you could find a significant group of people having more than 3 kids, say, who aren't regular churchgoers. You can find individuals, but I'd be surprised how many individuals you would find who, as a married couple, had more than 5 kids outside of a religious community.
Yeah, Orthodox Jews, I should mention.
Yes, well, Orthodox Jews, absolutely. And so they play a big role in family and friendly, because I used to live in a neighborhood right next to where there were 2 Orthodox synagogues, and got to know that neighborhood decently well. And they just... that talk about letting the kids run around. Well, you don't even drive on Saturday. Right. And there were people who would describe coming into their house, looking down, seeing 6 pairs of shoes and knowing they didn't belong to any of their children. So their children were at somebody else's house and these 6 kids were at their house. And so, mathematically, you could describe almost all of the birth rate decline by saying religious people have more children and America's becoming less religious.
Right.
And the reason that I would put that at the root cause is that all the different things I point to in the book are sort of secular changes that secularism has brought on the society. So the belief that your child's achievement determines his or her value is a rejection of the idea that we're made in the image of God and that humans have infinite value. The idea that you can't that you don't have an obligation to help your children raise their kids is a rejection of the commandment to love your neighbor. The idea that we're fundamentally bad, I think, is a rejection of, again, those ideas. And in general, the hyper-individualism, the sexual revolution, a lot of these were fruits of secularism, but also community. For the, married, college-educated, upper-middle-class secular people, they're still likely to have community. I wrote about this in my previous book, Family and Friendly, Robert Putnam in Bowling Alone, Charles Murray in Coming Apart talked about this. So there is still pretty strong communities. If you go to these sort of wealthy, mostly secular, people still leave their kids still leave their bikes on the front lawn, et cetera. There's a thriving little league where, the dads are all volunteering to coach, et cetera. But for the most part, and especially for the middle class and the working class, community in America has always meant church. And so that collapse in church going has meant a collapse in community and belonging for the middle class and the working class. So when you look at low marriage rates and high divorce rates among the working class, I think you chalk that up to a de-churchifying of the working class. Not because the sermons from Pastor Brown were so convincing that you should stay together, but that the community support, the modeling of the couple that's 10 years older, the advice, the mentoring, the norms, the babysitting, the things for your kids to do, et cetera, that was so valuable, and that has been lost. So even that collapse in community support we were talking about earlier, that is downstream from the secularization, the unchurchifying of American culture.
So is there an economic and political argument then that we need to engage here? Because you're mentioning class dynamics in there. So I guess we could go a couple different branches. We can go the branch of, are we blaming NAFTA for this? Are we blaming the breakdown of kind of labor unions and kind of high, or are we, on the other hand, blaming government intervention? Government came in too hard and gave away too much, and that created government dependence, which brought people away from dependence on their community and church, and then it incentivized family breakdown as well. Is there an economic political argument we need to bring in?
There's certainly, I'm much better at diagnosing the problems than prescribing solutions. And I don't mean to sound too cynical in that. I really admire the other type of people who will prescribe the solutions, and we can talk about some of them. But on the trade thing, I do believe that factory jobs were a great pro-family force in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I say in those decades because it's easy for us to think that was just sort of the norm, and then it got broken up by NAFTA. No, World War II created this situation where a lot of the men got training in the military. Right. Europe's economy was in shambles, and so we had to provide for everybody. So it was really easy, especially if you were like a white guy outside of Pittsburgh. It was really easy for you to get a job with no college education. Right. Count on that job lasting for 30 years. And one of the things I wrote about in my book was talking to this guy who just got laid off from a factory, and he was talking about how surprised he was. This was in 2005. How surprised he was that they asked him when he started if he had experience. He's like, "This is basically unskilled labor. I thought you were just going to train me in a morning. What is the skills that you need? What experience?" And the hiring guy said, "Do you have experience showing up on time every day? Do you have experience working to the whistle? Do you have the experience doing what you're told, even if it's boring, for a long amount of time?
Not being on drugs." Not
being on drugs. And I realized years later, all of those sort of unskilled skills were the skills I needed to be a dad. Right? Yeah. Like, I didn't have to get a PhD in diaper changing, in baby swaddling, in doing whatever my wife needed me to do. Like those were just basic virtues of being a reliable person, that anybody can have those skills, but not everybody does have those skills. So that's one way. And just having the working class reliable job really was a way to turn most men into good husbands and dads. And so losing that was definitely part of it. Again, I'm not confident that the right trade policy could bring those back, but anybody who says, "Oh, well, there was nothing particularly great about that period," is wrong. It really was a pro-family situation to have that. You talked about welfare. Certainly welfare pre-1990s was an anti-family force. Now it's more complicated. And this is something I try to balance in Family and Friendly when I talk about, well, should we increase aid to families? Should we increase a child tax credit? And I argue that some level of a child tax credit, a little bigger than we have now, is fundamental fairness. But I also say, well, at some point you discourage work. Now, is that bad or good? It depends. If you have a married couple and they get a little more money, and then mom or dad is able to work less, that's good. It's not good for the GDP, but it's good for the society. It's good for the parents and kids. If you have a single mom and you discourage work, is that good? There's no good answer to that question. It's bad to not have a parent around because they're always working. It's bad to not have an example of a working parent. Once you're in that situation of a single mom, there is no good answer. And what the right policy is a really, really difficult question.
Yeah. Well, I think just backdrop here for people who are watching or listening, they just need to recognize that these debates have been happening for a long time. I mean, especially, and they've been focusing on the economic sphere. I think what's changed more recently, and I think people like guests I've had here on this podcast before, Jonathan Haidt, Gene Twangy, and many others, have helped us to shift the conversation toward culture, to recognize that there's a cultural issue going on here that is not merely downstream from some sort of political or economic enactment, because that's related to the solutions. We can talk about policies that would be better or worse, but where we've seen this around the world, it hasn't always worked. And in fact, it's rarely worked in terms of making major economic or political changes and seeing
big economic policy trying to, or central government policy trying to reverse a falling birth rate or parental stress or childhood anxiety. There's no great example of that working. And a lot of these countries have really tried much harder than I think we're even talking about. The Nordic
countries, especially. And just before, we started this podcast, Brad Wilcox, who comes up often in these interviews on Gospelbound, just posted that Nordic countries have reported they've fallen right back.
Yep.
No gains.
And part of the reason that I discuss in the book is that their approach they said, okay, family and work are in tension and there are massive trade-offs. Absolutely correct. So we're going to solve it minimizing the trade-offs between family and work by relieving parents of having to raise their kids. Well, I mean, that really fosters one study by Lyman Stone at the Institute for Family Studies. He said that 10 years later, all of those cultures that did that, they all valued work more than they had before, and they valued family less than they had before.
They also, because of their culture, dictate that there can be no difference between the father and mother. That's a cultural value that they have to impose on the situation, which also in the end ends up creating more of a focus in the aggregate on work, because there's no particular intrinsic value to either father or mother.
And
what they do.
We try to turn women into company men with these policies. Now, I argue that I make a feminist argument that argues there should be more equality on a lot of family things. And I say instead of turning women into company men, we need to turn more company men into family guys.
Family guys, yeah.
And just be the guy who says, it's 5:00, I gotta go, my family needs me. That sort of leadership, and I've always worked in conservative institutions, the Washington Examiner, American Enterprise Institute, and I've always had bosses who said that sort of thing, who told me your family's more important than this job, and that was really important. Having policies that do that, and that there's this sort of old thing, I think a little inherited from the boomers. Some of my friends one guy said, we were a bunch of dudes standing around. He's like, my only job is to earn the paycheck and pay the mortgage. And I said, that's not true, Dave. Like, I saw you the other day pulling your kids in a wagon to the playground. Okay. You coach your daughter in basketball. Like, you're saying that because you feel like it's the macho thing to say. And so that's sort of my feminist argument, is dads just leading with being a dad. I'm a dad first. I'm a writer second. That sort of discussion of your occupation, that's the kind of feminism we need, not the kind of feminism that says we're going to turn you all into brass tacks girl bosses who do what's productive for the GDP.
Well, Tim, I've lived in a lot of different places, D.C., New York, Chicago, grew up on a farm in South Dakota, now live in Birmingham, Alabama. And what you're describing culture-wise, the community where I live is an interesting mixture of every single thing that you're trying to commend. It's a high religious environment. It's also a highly conservative environment. It's one of the most educated communities in America. It's also one of the highest income communities in America. And first thing I noticed when I came here as a dad is that nobody thought anything of expecting all of the dads to knock off at 4 or 5 o'clock to show up for their first grade or kindergarten t-ball practice and be there for the whole thing. I'll never forget last year in football, a friend of mine's third grade football, a friend of mine rushing in, and his son was probably 5-10 minutes late, something like that, which was kind of a big deal. You weren't supposed to be late. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it kind of a big deal. And he rushes in, and I look at him, and I'm like, and he says, yeah, I had to leave work early, but I left it to my colleagues. And I looked at him, and I said, you're a neurosurgeon.
Whose brain did you leave to your colleagues?
That's right. It's like, the nurses have got it under control. I was fine. But it was such pressure for him to leave to get his kid to the football practice because we were in the playoffs. We were heading toward the Super Bowl title, third grade tackle football. But I just noticed that there's a totally different value here on the involvement of the dads in the community and than there is in my experience with the subcultures I was in New York or Chicago, where the dads were routinely working 6, 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night.
No,
so
and
it's a culture thing. It's not yes, it's some economics, but I've lived in similar places with education and economics, and they don't have the same culture.
Yeah, and it's hard sometimes to predict what's going to dictate culture. I will say you do have to be on guard against the way too hyper sports culture.
That's the issue we have.
That's chapter 1 in the book.
We have that issue, and then the hyper involvement you have to be able to achieve culture. We have that problem.
And I don't think you should have to attend, certainly not practice. But when
That's
I set
pretty
up
intense.
The
it's
book,
pretty intense.
Family Unfriendly starts with a T-ball program that I sort of stumbled into and realized we were all there at Friday night on the field at St. Bernadette's, and that then suddenly all the parents were talking to each other and the little kids all ran off to the playground and it became this giant social thing. And I just thought, this is this idyllic thing. And I love baseball, so I would sit on a bench up on top of a hill chatting with another parent until my son came up because it was first grade baseball. So it wasn't going to be great baseball. I just wanted to cheer for Charlie when he got up and then realized like it didn't actually matter what happened in the game. And so, but that was such an oasis that I realized we had to create and replicate that and create these situations where we're trying to get, as the priest in my parish put it, a place where you can bring your children and ignore them while you have fun with other adults. And that was part of what was needed. So greater paternal involvement is a big part of what I write about. But at the same time, an intention with that is that kids being left alone and parents actually having friends is really important. Yeah. I bet if you were to interview young adults who don't want kids, I bet disproportionately they would say that their parents lived isolated lives.
I agree.
And I think if you look at my oldest, who has indicated that she basically wants to do what we're doing, like get married, have a bunch of kids, have a bunch of backyard barbecues, go to church. It's because she sees that we have fun lives, that our having kids brings us together with other families instead of making us hunker down and drive for maximum achievement of our children.
The 23-year-olds who don't want to get married and don't want to have kids were not that long ago the 14-year-olds whose parents were running ragged to every single thing that you described in there. So it's logical that they would not want their parents' lives.
And their parents that were driving home a message. When I talk about the travel sport trap, I talk about these studies showing that the specializers, the kids who for 12 months out of the year are doing one sport really intensely, they end up with a lower sense of their own worth. They're a lower sense of their own sports achievement, but just human worth. And part of it is their parents accidentally, in trying to give them the best of everything, signaled to them, well, what really matters to us is that you are a great goalie at field hockey. And then you get up to this higher level and you realize there's 10 other girls my age who are better field hockey goalies than me, which is good to realize that you're not the best, but it's depressing when you've been sent this message that this is where your value is.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a few more questions here with Tim Carney talking about family unfriendly, how our culture made raising kids much harder. Last survey I saw, and I think we've had something of a breakthrough. Even this presidential campaign, there's been more talk than I've ever seen before about family policy, about infertility, fertility rates, all this sort of stuff, family formation. I've never seen this discussion reach this level. And yet the last survey I saw, by far, more people still thought we have too many kids. Not too few kids, but too many kids. That 1980s overpopulation propaganda that turned out to be completely false, I just still think is lodged in people's minds in addition to everything you're talking about here. So I'm going to ask the question that comes out of those folks. Why should our society care about what you're writing about? Wouldn't there be some positives for a society with fewer children?
I mean, so that's absolutely the question I get. And I quote people when I was working on this book asking me on Twitter, like, why do you care? Are you trying to control women's bodies or whatever? And I point out, 2.7. That's the average we get when people ask, what is the ideal number of children to have? Yeah. Now, I wish it was higher, but it's actually on the way up. But that's not the main thing. The main thing I'm writing about is the difference between that 2.7 and the 1.6 we're already having. So we are failing as a culture if we have that big of a deficit in something that's so important as family. But then as far as the benefits of a shrinking population, there would be some. I mean, so right now, think about the current 12-year-olds. When they're in the labor market 10 years from now, unemployment is going to be pretty close to zero.
Because salaries are going way up.
Salaries are going to be up because there's going to be so many retirees, more retirees than ever, and fewer workers than ever. The working age population, even with our immigration rates, working age population is going to start shrinking in the next few years. And so they'll see higher wages. Unemployment will be very low. The flip side of
higher taxes too.
Flip side of that benefit is higher taxes and just inflation and longer wait times. There's not somebody, you and I when we're too old to do a home repair, call somebody, say, hey, I've got this leaky sink. Okay, yeah, I'll come in 12 days, and they'll be able to charge whatever they want. And then one of the main ways in which economics is contributing to the baby bust is the cost of buying a home has gone so far up. And so about 30 years from now, maybe it'll turn around, because the problem is the millennials are the biggest generation. So for the next few years, they'll still be buying homes. But then as the people in the generations that are shrinking, which again, I put, around age 12, 13, 14, as they become the prime house buying generation, you will see. So now we're talking 18, 20 years from now, I guess, you will see a slight downward pressure on home prices. And so theoretically, there could be a very delayed offsetting thing. But there's a problem with that theory. Look at Japan. As these small towns got so small that they couldn't even support basically like a sewer and water infrastructure, everybody moved into Tokyo. Right. And Tokyo did a great job of building a ton of apartment buildings so that housing prices didn't go too high. But then what happened? Everybody started living in apartments. And that ends up not being pro-family.
It's not family.
And so it's possible that, when the population is really shrinking 20 and 30 years from now, it'll be more affordable for people to buy a house in the suburbs and raise kids. That's the possible positive upside I can see about this. But watching what's happened in countries that are 30 years ahead of us, that's not the way their populations reacted.
Yeah. How did the sexual revolution give us a sexual recession?
Yeah, so this is one of the things I wouldn't have predicted. You know, that 20 years from now, we would be worried about young people not getting together enough. But so I quote one woman in the book saying, yes, there's hookup culture on college campuses, but that's really a lack of relationship culture. Men and women have forgotten how to get to know each other, how to have relationships, both friendships and romantic relationships. And so I argue that one of the things is that the normalization of casual sex has created this situation where people are afraid to go on dates.
Yeah.
If a girl says, I don't want it to be that if I say yes to dinner, I'm saying yes to a lot more and maybe really freaky stuff. But that's the way a lot of them feel because of that normalization. So the result is less dates, and less getting together and less getting married. And then the hyper-individualism implied by the sexual revolution means, well, autonomy is the only good. If you're married, you know that you're giving up a lot of your autonomy. You don't wake up every morning and say, you know what, I do want to stay married to you today. It's a lifelong commitment.
Right.
And it's even more so with children. And then finally, as we argued earlier, I think that the normalization of the birth control pill and all of that made it so that people don't feel any obligation to help other people raise their kids.
Yeah. Well, related to this, 4 years ago, David Brooks wrote a blockbuster article arguing that the nuclear family was a mistake. Now, Tim, I doubt you would frame your argument the same way that he did, but explain your view on the shift from extended families toward the nuclear family and how it's contributed to your concerns.
Part of what Brooks was talking about in that article was just saying the nuclear family can't survive on its own.
Right.
And I say this as somebody who believes so firmly from my own childhood and a really tight-knit nuclear family and my own adult life where it's what I primarily identify as a husband and a dad. That's like saying the heart or the brain are the most important organ. Fine, but they can't exist on their own. They need to be supported. You need cousins, you need in-laws, you need grandparents. In fact, the contribution when one study looked at when you have a first kid, are you more or less likely to have a second kid given various factors? Having affordable daycare didn't actually make you more likely to have the second kid. That surprised me. Having help from your mom or your mother-in-law did make you much more likely to have that kid. We talk about how my wife's younger sisters did so much babysitting when our kids were younger. And now those same kids of ours are babysitting for their for their cousins, my nieces and nephews. And so the way that works, the modeling, the advice, the commiserating, oh my gosh, I got woken up again. Why is this 6-year-old reverting? All of that's so important for parents. Extended family is the best. And then the second best is going to be tight-knit communities that provide that.
Just a couple more questions here. And this one, you kind of too hard on yourself saying you don't have any solutions, because I do think some of the best parts of the book are related to some of the maybe not solutions, but recommendations or examples that you allow. So I'm just wondering here, what's the best thing churches could do right now to help and encourage families? Because I think there's a few options here. And the real answer, I'm sure, is all of the above, but I'd love you to identify where you want to focus. We can set up singles to marry. We can help them to do that. Date nights for parents. You already referenced your family Fridays with games and food. Direct teaching on the biblical importance of family. Where do you want to go with that?
I mean, I think all of those are important. And just starting from, you know how sometimes like nowadays corporate America feels they have to put like a climate impact statement in there. And some people like climate leads on everything. I think we need to put family there. And you pointed to help people get married, help married people have kids, help people stay married and not murder their kids when their kids are driving them crazy. And a local congregation providing sort of material support, what we Catholics call the corporal works of mercy, ministries for supporting the not yet married, the married, those who have kids, and then the teenagers, et cetera, that is all important. If you were to ask me to emphasize just one of them, I would say that, the helping families get together in ways that provide both mixed age play, but also parents having connection. The isolation of, suburban middle class, upper middle class parenthood is one of the real curses of.
So that's where the date night might not be helpful.
So date night is good. Date night is good, but also like trivia night. And then you provide babysitting. So we have Catholic trivia night at my local parish. And so we get together and it's like 12 of us at a table after a little reception with snacks. And if you also provide babysitting there, then all of a sudden you're
so is it trivia
friends.
On Catholic things or just Catholics doing trivia?
It's both. It's both. Okay. And so like, was it Pope Leo the II or Pope Leo the First? And yes.
Okay. Very good. Well, I do commend people in the book to check out the Family Fridays. It was one of the most helpful things. And I'm so glad.
And it's right in the first section, so it's easy to read.
Get it right away. And I appreciate you mentioning that is the alternative to what I was talking about earlier with the positives in our community. But yes, the thing that goes along with general wealth in a community and education is a tendency to overprogram. You just have parents who they've gotten ahead in life by being very responsible, and they intend to pass that along. But it's not replicable necessarily, and it's not even ideal. Family Fridays offer a good alternative, good example that any church, I think, could pretty much implement. Last question is, why do you say parenting is a cheat code for singles?
So I'm glad you asked that, because that probably should have been my answer to the previous question. The Bible tells us to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And if you have children, you wake up and there are hungry, naked people right there in your house. They're right there for you. That the idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of actually desiring the good of another person more than your own comfort or immediate happiness, there are people who pull that off naturally. There are natural saints like that. But for me, it took marriage for me to first want to, subordinate myself to my wife and rank her number one. And then children sort of makes that more natural, where your happiness is actually rooted in their happiness. So these good traits that come to us, I think marriage and parenthood both make these things not easy, but easier and simpler and more straightforward.
Yeah. We just had an event with the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics, which I lead. We did an event with Ross Douthat in New York City. And one of the things we talked about was marriage and singleness. And he mentioned how within the Catholic Church, they're both opportunities are commended. That's something that we Protestants sometimes have a challenge with, because as soon as we commend the one, it seems like we're forsaking the other in there. And so it's a good way to understand that there's a dignity to both vocations. There's a dignity to both callings. There are advantages and disadvantages. But generally speaking, there are not many voices right now commending a lot of the wisdom that has been taken for granted in the past about parenting.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, one of the places you can find that wisdom, Timothy Carney's new book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder. Tim, been a great guest. Thanks for joining me on Gospelbound.
Thank you. My pleasure.